Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists and moderators, it is an honor for STM to jointly host this event with the All-European Academies ALLEA and the Global Young Academy GYA on inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, in short AGYA, in scholarly peer review. My name is Barbara Kalumenos, and I'm the Director for Public Affairs at STM. Also with me are Matthijs Vleugel, Scientific Policy Officer of ALLEA, and Anna Maria Gramate, Senior Project Manager, Office of the Global Young Academy, who are the key people in preparing and organizing this event. However, when it comes to substance of this event, I like to mention the valuable input and support of Professor Luc Dury, ALLEA Vice President, and Professor Stefania Mondella, member of the Global Young Academy, and our STM member, Baha Memani from Elsevier. The peer review system currently does not accurately represent the scholarly community as a whole. There are many groups, such as women, early career researchers, non-native English speakers, researchers from the Global South, to name a few, that are underrepresented. This creates many challenges, while also there are new ideas and approaches developing that could improve AGYA in peer review. The three co-organizing entities felt that this topic needs more attention and awareness. And this was the starting point that we decided to jointly organize this moderated panel discussion. Let me welcome our panelists coming from the different parts of the world. And I really want to express my thank you to them that they find the time to join us today. And allow me to introduce our moderator, Jessica Polka. Jessica Polka served as Executive Director of ALLEA Bio, a researcher-driven non-profit organization working to promote innovation and transparency in life science publishing in areas such as preprinting and open peer review. Prior to this, she performed postdoctoral research in the Department of Systems Biology at the Harvard Medical School, following a PhD in the biochemistry and cell biology of the UCSF. Jessica is also a Plan S ambassador, an affiliate of the Knowledge Future Group, and a steering committee member of Rescuing Biomedical Research. And before I give the floor to Jessica, I would like to do some housekeeping. And I think, Matthijs, you have to go, yes, one slide back. So we really would like that you display your full name and affiliation. We want to make you aware that this meeting will be recorded, and we plan also to put it online for those who were not able to join us today. We really like you to ask to put your question into the Q&A box. Please indicate if your question is for a particular panelist. Otherwise, we assume it's just for everybody of the panel. And the chat function can be used for communication within the audience. We, the three organizers, ALLEA, Global Young Academy, and STM, are now wishing you an interesting discussion with hopefully good interactions. And I have to say now, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to all of the organizers, panelists, and also you and the audience for being a part of this conversation. I think it's incredibly important, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. So in the next slide, I want to begin with some words from Kenny Gibbs, who has written a really fantastic article in Scientific American about the importance of diversity in STEM. And this quote is really from the kind of subheadings of this article. He writes, "Diversity is integral to excellence. Lack of diversity represents a loss of talent." And so I think it's very clear to note how this point that Kenny is making, that by excluding people from working on society's most important problems, by excluding people from science and scholarship, we are actually weakening our capacity to tackle these problems. So I think there's really a pragmatic argument, which is supported by evidence that Kenny cites in this reference here, for increasing diversity that goes, really, it's a very clear statement. However, I think that even if this were not true, there is a moral imperative to create a just environment in which people are capable of participating in some of these endeavors of research and of pursuit of knowledge. This is a really fundamental process in our society, and so excluding people from it is not only pragmatically not practical, but it is also unethical in some way. So in the next slide, I want to call out the fact that IDEA is really a challenge for society and science as a whole. This is certainly not an issue that is limited to peer review of journal articles, peer review of scholarly work. We have major problems with structural racism, misogyny, xenophobia, ableism, as well as many other kind of divisive issues. In addition, these inequalities are affecting academia. So there's disparities in funding, and the demographics of the training pipeline, certainly the demographics of senior researchers do not accurately reflect the demographics of incoming trainees. So there are knowledge biases in funding, hiring, who is speaking at events in many different ways. And there's also, I think these affect disparities in publishing, and publishing is of course related to funding, it's related to hiring, it's related to all these issues. So we really have to have this conversation within that context. But today, we're going to be talking about how the peer review of scholarly work can be affected by biases against authors, and how the reviewing pool and the editorial pool perhaps can be more accurately reflective of authors in a given field. So with that, I want to highlight in the next slide that there are many different reasons for this. First, I think that for scholarship as a whole, bringing diverse perspectives into the review of manuscripts can help to identify practices in scholarship that are sort of unhelpful. For example, parachute science, in which researchers from high-income countries may sort of come in and create research about a certain area without really appropriately engaging people who are directly affected by that issue. Or there are issues in sex differences in biological research that might be better addressed through training reviewers or by paying more attention to perspectives in that process. For authors, I think that peer review is an important gatekeeper for not only what we consider knowledge, but also career advancement. And so if peer review is affected by biases, this can have a profound impact on individual researchers as they move through their career. And I think that there's evidence to suggest that groups not well represented amongst peer reviewers are experience bias in this process. There are some documented examples of homophily in peer review, which we can discuss in the following slides. But even on the side of reviewers can also benefit from a more equitable system. Invitation to peer review is, it kind of has a status of being recognition as a trusted expert in a field. And while I think that it is definitely undervalued and a task that does not necessarily carry rewards proportional to the benefit it provides to researchers, it can be reported for tenure and promotion. Pragmatically, there are some examples. For example, in the United States, there's a green card process which confers permanent residency, and peer review is often used as evidence of expertise for this process. So I think that there are real consequences to being asked to serve as a peer reviewer, even beyond the incredibly important ability to influence the publication decision or the perceptions of readers about a work. So in the next slide, there are many different dimensions of diversity in peer review, many different dimensions that are not necessarily represented, things that can affect how peer review proceeds. So for example, there is an influence of the author's prestige on reviewers' decision that recently was reported by Huber et al., where Nobel laureates were very much favored in this review process. But even among professional networks, having a co-author in common with the author under review has been shown to affect a higher peer review score. Certainly, there's author-reviewer homophily in geography, and we know that editorial boards are not very diverse, with overrepresentation in the US and Europe. In language is also another major issue. I think the fact that we're having this conversation, for example, in English, and that this English is often used as kind of the default language in many fields. And that in addition to that, there's also bias and stylistic attitudes that are not necessarily related to the content of the work that is brought up in peer review. Furthermore, career stage, certainly I think many people associate being a peer reviewer with being later in one's career, but it is known that early career researchers are participating in review in many fields, but they're not necessarily credited or acknowledged as such. Institution can certainly also affect perceptions, and there's also author-reviewer homophily in gender. In race and ethnicity, there's very little proportionally that is known in journal peer review, although there is evidence that grant peer review disparities can be reduced with name redaction, and this is based upon the US NIH granting system. But I think even beyond all of this, outside of all of these dimensions, abilities, so that last letter in IDEA, I think we also have to consider how peer review is or is not accessible to people who may have differing abilities. So certainly a PDF is not the most accessible type of document, and the preparation of figures that is not sensitive to color blindness is also an issue. All right, and so I want to share a brief outline of today's agenda. First, we will discuss the barriers to IDEA and peer review. We're going to hear from all of you through polls, and we're also going to hear from each one of our panelists, who I'll introduce momentarily. We're going to have a conversation about the barriers first, and then we're going to have a conversation about solutions next. So with that, in the next slide, I want to open it up now to all of you. So Slido is, if you have not used it before, is a tool for soliciting polling in webinars. And so you can either take a phone, for example, point it at the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and type in this code that you see here, 3487304. And you can then answer this polling question. We are looking for your sense of what the biggest barriers for IDEA are in peer review. So I see that someone is ranking these. Thank you so much. I know that ranking can take a little bit of time. So I will, just allow people to get their answers in before we move on. So it really seems like there's a large, certainly this is not a scientific poll, but I do think that we are seeing a lot of attention placed on lack of reviewer diversity. and implicit biases in academia. Certainly, I think those biases extend well beyond academia as well, unfortunately, but it affects editor diversity as well, who's advancing to these roles too. So thank you so much, and apologies for cutting that short, but I want to introduce now our panelists. So we have Michael Barber, who is Emeritus Professor at Flinders University in Australia, and also steering group member of ISD's Future of Scientific Publishing project. Hasib Irfanullah, a consultant and part-time visiting fellow at the University of Liberal Arts in Bangladesh. Pradeep Kumar, personal professor at University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and a member of the Global Young Academy. And Nicola Nugent, Royal Society of Chemistry, publishing manager, quality and ethics, and STM member. So with that, I'd now like to ask our panelists, first, beginning with Michael, what are the biggest barriers for IDEA in peer review?
Thank you, Jessica. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Great. Greetings from an ungodly hour down in Australia. So if you want to talk about diversity, we should probably talk about the fact that if you live in the Southern Hemisphere, you always have to get up at midnight to talk to people in the Northern Hemisphere. That's my gripe. Anyway, I'm actually going to rehash some of the issues that Jessica spoke about in my couple of minutes before we go into this discussion, because to put it bluntly, I think the single biggest barrier to IDE in peer review is the same problem that is in publishing, and it's the same problem that's in science. And that comes back, in my opinion, simply to the culture of science itself, or the culture that has in fact developed, perhaps predominantly in the Western parts of the system, or the developed parts of the system, and perhaps most acutely in the Anglosphere. And that is the fact that we have today a publishing system which is driven by, or drives a set of rather insidious incentives into the system. And these in turn have now built to the point where we have more emphasis placed on where you publish versus what you publish. And on top of that, with the idea that a journal impact factor is a pseudo measure of proxy for quality. So why must this change? Because I don't believe if we simply worry about IDE in peer review, we're going to be successful, because that system has so many vested interests. And so that comes back critically to the fact that the scientific community is itself not aware, as was put onto one of the issues, of the criticality of diversity. Jessica put up that interesting paper from National Academy, which looked at performance of small groups. There is a vast literature about the importance of diversity in producing better teams, better groups. I would recommend the book by Scott Page called The Difference, which talks about predominantly cognitive diversity, but he actually shows that teams work much better. But Page's analysis has two aspects to it. One, we expect that diverse teams are made up of diverse skills, diverse experiences, diverse, etc. Page's work puts another very critical factor into play, and that is that the members of the teams must, in fact, embrace their diversity. They must be comfortable talking about issues outside their domain of speciality. There's no point putting an economist and an ecologist onto a working party to discuss climate change if they're going to talk past each other. They need to, in fact, embrace what they do not know. A few years ago, I chaired on behalf of the Australian Council of Learned Academies a project called Securing Australia's Future. We did 10 projects with working groups drawn from the 4 academies. And that was across humanities, social sciences, science, medicine, engineering, etc. I chaired the oversight group and I took one issue away from it at the end. When the teams knew how to talk among themselves, we made progress. We produced great reports with great impact. When they were dominated by one particular view, we had problems both in the reports and in fact in their impact. So my lesson here out of all of this is we need to in fact recognize that our scientific colleagues do not recognize the power of diversity and that they do not understand the vast work that has gone to show this works in many, many areas. Final little cite for the advantages. There's a phenomenal report out of the Brookings Institute, which looks at diverse communities in the United States. And they find that those that are diverse racially, geographically, well, I suppose a community is not necessarily geographically dispersed, but embracing different cultural groups, different lifestyle groups, they are more resilient and most importantly, they map to the centers of innovation. Yet it amazes me as I come towards the end of my career that science has become more and more fragmented. And we talk about, and that fragmentation has meant that experts tend to find their own little picture and they don't move outside it. So I'm actually very much of the view that we need to change that system, and how we do it, I'm not sure, because it's a tough, tough call. But I suppose I'm a little crotchety in my old age, and I tend to sort of say that if we don't face some of these big challenges and try and do it by doing bits and pieces along the way, we're going to fail. But you must talk, and that's why this working group is a phenomenal working group. My final work with the Global Youth Academy, and in a project a couple of years ago, Founded Academies Partnership, I was very impressed with the GYA. I think we need to be careful, we being in this case the older people, that we don't expect you to carry this battle, because you are the ones whose careers, unfortunately, are going to be measured by some of the metrics we've imposed upon you. We have to change the system. And that's one of the important things that perhaps I'll talk a bit in my second comment that comes out of the ISC publishing. I think, Jessica, that's enough from me. Perhaps not quite on the way you wanted me to focus it, but I'm afraid I do actually think the cultural issues are critical. And changing culture is something I've had some experience with over my years. It's tough, but it can be done. And we just have to keep plugging away at it. Thanks for inviting me. I hope I made a few useful comments.
Thank you very much, Michael. I certainly couldn't agree with you more that there are many cultural issues in academia that need to be addressed as well. I want to turn over now to Haseeb.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to answer to your question, Jessica. I would like to focus on 2 specific points. I will be focusing only on peer review itself. My first point is, if we think of peer review, essentially we are talking about quality assurance of our research, or how to ensure kind of research integrity before we communicate or use research. So in a sense, we are putting peer review in the middle of 2 different sides, supply and demand. It is just the middle between the researcher and authors and the readers and research users. But when we talk about peer review, we emphasize it, we highlight it, but we need to ask ourselves that, are we sufficiently valuing the voluntary contributions of peer reviewers? Here, by we, I mean not only the journals or the editors, I'm talking about the authors, the host institutions of the reviewers, the promotions, the rules, and the recruitment committees. Do they value that as well? What about the policymakers or research users? Do they value peer review system, or the society in general? So my first point is, if we can't ensure that kind of value or recognition of peer review as well as peer reviewer, how can we ensure diversity, inclusion, and equity? My second point is regarding framing and communicating the barriers that we will be discussing today. Because those barriers and challenges, these are often context specific. it depends upon a much or related to much wider issues. It could be related to a country's economy, the development priorities of a society, how the national research system or the regional research system is working, whether the society recognizes or accepts research as a whole, as a source of evidence, or researchers as well. So my second point is that it is quite important to contextualize the challenges we will be discussing today, to understand. Sometimes some issues are quite general, but we need to think how those issues are operating in a particular context, in a specific country, in a specific society, and in a specific discipline. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Hasib. Absolutely. I think you raised some incredibly important points there about how important this is, and yet we don't necessarily address that in the way we treat reviewers. Now let's go to Pradeep.
Thank you, Jessica. And I cannot agree more than Michael and Hasib as well. So I come from the early career researcher perspective. I'm from the global south, and I'm in southern hemisphere as Michael is, but I'm very lucky to be in Africa. So I'm closer to the GMT. So I don't have to so I do most of the work in the afternoons than in the mornings and evenings. So it's I'm a bit lucky there. So for the peer review, I will raise 3 points. Okay, the first one I will say is innovation. Okay, so we all know, and this is a well-known fact, that young scientists are more innovative. Okay, there are some, I'm raising some issues here, but there's no doubt about it, and proportionality is missing then. Okay, so how many PhD students, postdocs, and early career researchers who just started their research are into the peer review process? So that's very much missing. Okay, but even if there's, so the point I'm raising is here that are we matching the challenges with challenges? Okay, so for example, if someone submits a paper and they have written by say a young student or a young scientist and not reviewed by a young scientist again, so it's not a match. Okay, so we're not matching the expertise with expertise. I'll just say that one. So the review of the work of others is being lagged by the ECRs and young scientists, and then we again, the system has to be corrected, as Michael said. The second point I want to mention is sometimes is our own, is early career researchers, not mistake, but when you say ignorance in some cases. For example, we're not visible enough, or they are not visible enough, or people don't see them enough. For example, when someone submits a paper, they register the authors. Okay, so the authors get registered themselves, not themselves, by someone else, and then you pull down the arrow author reviewer, so you never click the reviewer button. Okay, and then you always be an author, never available as a reviewer. Okay, so that's a visibility issue. Okay, so that's a very big barrier, and if you are not availing yourself as a reviewer, or they are not being availed as a reviewer, okay, it's not seen as a reviewer, then is also a very, very big issue. Okay, so that's the visibility, the innovation, that's the two very important thing. And I will also say this thing, that junior authors, or whatever you say, early career researchers, they actually are very versed with details. So they have every fine detail of the new techniques and a new ELISA method, or I can name so many in biology, but I don't know anything about engineering, but in pharmacy, and the new techniques, image processing, all these things. Okay, so the new researchers are very well versed with that, but if they are not being reviewed by an equal person and who knows these techniques, they are actually put down and say, okay, no, this is not really required. Okay, it's an extra data, put in supplementary information. So it's a barrier of what you say, keeping up with the techniques and technologies. The last one I will say is, and I again agree with Michael. Michael said so many things that we can always take forward, and that system. Okay, so even if everything changes, and Michael says the system needs to change. Okay, so I say, okay, system is changed, ECRs and early career researchers and diversity is there, but are the reviews valued? Okay, so if there are 3 reviewers in the panel and one is early career, is a diverse diversity from the diversity group, let's say underrepresented group. So is the review submitted by that person is valued enough? So if he or she says rejection, and the paper is get accepted even after the person says rejection, okay, even other, so this is the value there, okay? So even if you include diverse people, diversity, the system still the system is not valuing it, then it's very difficult to actually take it forward. And I'm from GYA, and Michael, we heard you, and we will change the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Fantastic points there. And I'm looking forward to talking more about how we can actually value reviewers. And I think the structure of review really, as you say, has this way of regressing to a mean in some fashion. So let's really looking forward to talking more about that. To close off our panel, I would love to hear now from Nicola.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, so I'm coming from the perspective of someone working at a society publisher, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and it's been really great to hear you and the other panelists set the scene and talk about peer review as one aspect of the sort of broader culture and systems and research as a whole. And it's really important to acknowledge and recognise that peer review is just one aspect of that broader cultural sort of picture. But just to highlight again and echo some of the things that Jessica and the other panelists have already said, peer reviews is an important aspect of that culture because, rightly or wrongly, publications are still somewhat the sort of currency of academia, and having what is perceived as a strong publication record is seen as an essential for academic career progression. Again, rightly or wrongly. So. Bias and lack of inclusion in peer review are therefore adding to those barriers to progression for underrepresented groups. And Royal Society of Chemistry, we've done some work on that a few years ago with respect to gender, and we published a landmark report called Breaking the Barriers. I'll share the link in a moment, which gives some insights into the barriers facing women, barriers to progression that women face in the chemical sciences. And we followed that up with a report, Is Publishing in the Chemical Sciences Gender Biased? Again, I'll share the link in a moment. And in that report, we were able to provide evidence of gender differences at each stages of our publication process, right from which journals women choose to submit to, the proportion of women reviewers, the chances of acceptance, and the rates of citation of papers authored by women. And so that really spurred us on to take action to try and reduce biases for everyone, not just women, in our publication processes. But what I want to highlight as one of the sort of the barriers here is in trying to understand how we can improve inclusion and diversity in our peer review and publication processes. A really fundamental barrier is a lack of data. So for our gender bias report, we had to use assumed gender. We didn't know the gender of our authors and reviewers. We had to use a sort of algorithmic method to assume it. And many publishers, RSA included until very recently, don't collect diversity data from our authors, reviewers and editors. So we don't know who our authors, reviewers and editors are. We don't know their background. We can't understand that sort of baseline diversity of who our community is. And that means we can't identify those gaps. We can't identify who it is that's underrepresented. And therefore that makes it very difficult to plan the right interventions, if you like, to improve representation and improve inclusion. So that's one of the major barriers for me. I think there are others that people have touched on and that I'm sure we'll come into in the discussion, things around implicit biases in our processes and how these play into the different types of peer review models that we use. But I'm going to leave my opening comments for there. I'm sure we'll get into those in our discussion in a moment.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Nicola, that was really fantastic. And I really take your point about the fact the need for more data. Like, it's very hard to steer a ship without knowing where it's going. I want to now turn back to a point that Pradeep brought up, which is the fact that the early career researchers have a lot of strengths. They're innovative, they know the techniques, they are very perhaps tuned in to what's happening with the methodology, and yet they're not often considered as a peer reviewer. So the question I'd like to pose to the panel is, who should we consider to be a peer? And why is this difficult to change? What do we do to broaden this definition of peer in the ways that you think it should be broadened? Maybe I'll turn to Pradeep first, because it's relevant to what you've written, what you said, but I'd love to hear also from the other panelists too.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. So if you have asked me like 10 years ago that who is a peer, so I will say I will go for an expert. Okay, so expert in the same field. Okay, but now the things have changed. I'm changed actually. So now I will say a scientist in the same field. Okay, I would rather not saying an expert in the same field. I would rather say a scientist in the same field, but with a disclosure that not competing interests. Okay, so competing. So we also in conflict of interest statements, but we never sign competing interest statements. So do we have a competing interest? So I'll 2 words: scientist in the same field, and with someone which is not having a competent interest of yeah. So this kind of. So I'll leave it there. Yes.
Thank you. Do others agree?
I'm happy to come in on that. Yeah, definitely agree that there's this sense that, you need your peer reviewer to have expertise in the subject matter of, the article you're asking them to review, or the piece of work they're being asked to review. But I think there's definitely opportunities for us to broaden what we mean by that, and to be much more inclusive, especially of early career researchers, and recognizing the expertise that they do have. What do we actually mean by expert? In the context of reviewing a journal article, that expertise quite often needs to be very focused in a particular area, and there's absolutely no reason why early career researchers can't be included in that process. And that in itself, then, as you mentioned at the beginning, Jessica, you said that the diversity of our earlier career researchers is greater than that of more senior researchers, and so by being more inclusive of early career researchers, that's also opening up the inclusivity and diversity of our peer reviewers more generally.
Thanks, Nicola. Does anyone else want to follow up here, Hasib?
Yeah, I think I very much agree with what Pradeep and Nicola mentioned. But we also need to remember that sometimes those peers are, depending upon the discipline, depending upon the research we are talking about, it may vary, because as Nicola mentioned, that expertise, we need to define expertise. And it is not like that early career. The word early seems like they are young, they are novice, but it might not be, isn't it? Sometimes we are not early career researchers. We might not be as knowledgeable as the early career ones. So we need to think of defining, as you rightly suggested, that how to define peers, as well as how to define experts. So is how to define early. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. These are fantastic points. I want to also turn now to a question from the audience. Martin Dominic has asked whether peer review should serve as gatekeeping. And I think that I've heard already from Michael making calls for changes in our publishing culture. And Nicola, I think you acknowledged that whether or not we wanted to act as gatekeeping, it is. But I think maybe let's put this question to the panel. Should peer review serve as gatekeeping? What is the utility of peer review serving as gatekeeping, if any? And can that be served in other ways if it is necessary? And also, what are the damages of viewing peer review as gatekeeping? Michael.
I will leap off the deep end on that one. I think to deal with the issues that we're talking about, we need to consider very carefully a repurposing of review in a reformulated publication system. The ISC in its 8 principles have articulated a number relevant to this discussion. One is global access, independent of origin, independent of financial statement, and a continued importance on peer review. However, I think we have become to recognize that peer review sweeps a number of sins, but different sorts of sins I want to talk about. There's a sense that it is a gatekeeper, but it's an imperfect gatekeeper. And in fact, the most important part of peer review is what you might call post-publication peer review, where, in the words of David Merman, the publication of interest gets brought into the tapestry of science as it is. And tapestry is a really nice metaphor here, because often tapestries are made of threads and you can't pull the tapestry apart, but you can break the threads. And so peer review over time builds people's knowledge into this wider spectrum. So I'm now very strongly of the view that the initial review, and it should be a review before it becomes public, and we ought to remember that publish comes from the Latin to make public. And whether it's put on my own view is just put on what I call now a regulated preprint server. And this has been one of the things that several of us on the ISC working group are pushing quite hard for now. And that first review looks at a couple of issues. One is data available. The data isn't available, the author should be told to put your data in a repository. And secondly, and here automatic scanning tools can play a role, is that publication reasonably expected to be reproducible or replicable? In other words, have you given enough information so someone else can repeat your science, etc.? Because that's the strength of science. If the answer to that is no, send it back, let them work. These new tools emerging, I believe personally, will be used by the authors before they submit. But I think journals now need to start asking that question. And preferably, I think you put it up on a peer review. I'll close with two examples, very interestingly. On Archive last week, a 112-page paper was put up by a number theorist claiming to have solved one of the great mysteries of mathematics. He's done it before, so he's got a bit of a track record. It will never be published in a journal. He won't publish it in a journal, but he wants the community to work through his 112-page proof to establish that it is true. It is a wonderful example of open post review. The second one, if you remember the Lancet COVID scandal, if that had been put on a peer review on a preprint server, it was killed in a few days of publication. So open peer review does work, but the first phase must be a strengthening of the sorts of publications that are put up. And I don't worry, I do worry about fraud. I just worry about sloppy science, poor reporting of data sets, etc. Fix that, and I believe you've got a great opening up, because the post review is open to everybody. And early career researchers can come into that review in a very enriching way. And we need that viewing. We need the view of the global south. We would not have understood COVID without the view of the global south. So I actually think we have to change, with due respect to the Royal Society of Chemistry, which has actually done some great work in this space. But I actually hope I live long enough to see people publishing on regulated preprint servers and given full credit for their publication.
Nicola, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to really add to what Michael is saying there, that, you know, I think peer review is that as a gatekeeper is changing. So journal peer, I sort of suppose I want to define the different types of peer review a bit maybe. So journal peer review is serving as a gatekeeper because journals are using it to decide what gets published in their journal. So they're using it as a sort of way to curate the content, and ideally, if it works correctly, you know, the papers that are of most interest to the readers of that journal get published in the journal. But as Michael's pointed out, in today's world, we have, of course, preprint servers and lots of other ways for researchers to disseminate their research. And the peer review there is serving a different purpose. You know, that's potentially could be much more about those validation, reproducibility aspects. So I certainly think there's space for both of those types of peer review to exist, where we have there's still this element of curation, so that that readers can be, you know, directed to research that's of most interest to them. I think there's, you know, I think, as we mentioned, the huge volume of research that's out there. Journals or, you know, collections of articles can help sort of you know, direct attention to different aspects of research, and, you know, that can sit alongside that broader dissemination of research on things like preprint servers.
Thank you, Nicola. Any other points, especially about this issue of gatekeeping? Yes, Pradeep.
It's okay. I just went a very short point about, I love how patents are done, you know, so we already have a system, you know, and it's an old system. So in case of patents, you apply for a patent. I'm not saying everyone to apply for a patent, but the system is there. So you apply for a patent, it's published as an application after certain checkpoints. Okay, so regulation checkpoints, and then you publish the application. It's granted or not granted is a matter of examination. Okay, so it's so something like that will work with post-publication review as well. So you have some science done, you have studies done, you publish it, and then post-publication happens, and then you decide is which journal it goes to, or, and I'm just throwing things away here, but the throwing ideas. But the thing is, it's just like you after post-publication, then you decide, or you know, so there is a system, but that it needs to be translated into publication. So patenting system can be done. Yes, that system can be used. That's my view on that.
Thank you. Fantastic. If there's any other points about gatekeeping, I want to just highlight how important I think this conversation about open science is as well. And it leads really into another question, which is that we have many different models of review that exist. I'm thinking, you know, we've been talking about open review on preprints, open discussions. Miguel Oliveira from the audience has brought this point up as well, like that open preprint discussions can be a form of peer review. But I would like to ask the panel, how do different models of peer review affect IDEA? So, you know, of course, we have single anonymized, double anonymized, we have open or transparent peer review. We have things where the manuscript is open on a preprint server. We have, you know, the ability for people to come in to communicate beyond the invited reviewers. So how do all of these different models, and how do traditional models affect inclusion and diversity? And Michael, I see you getting ready to speak. Yeah, please go ahead, Michael.
Oh, sorry. In fact, I want to ask a question of Nicola. In fact, I'm going to put on notice that an Australian colleague, I mean, Ginny Barber, who might be in the audience, no, not different spelling of a surname. In a bit of email discussion today, we raised a question about whether there was any real experiments that backed up the different sorts of peer review. I've racked my brains, and I think I can find one or two papers and but how good the models are. But it does seem to me it would be a very useful step for several of the journals to decide to set up a rigorous assessment of some of these different sorts of peer review systems. It does take a little bit of work to work out what the purposes of peer review are. And, you know, I think that would be a particularly useful exercise, because my worry at the moment is that there are multiple uses of peer review, all of which are good. But in most of the cases, it comes back, whether it's grants or promotion, etc., it comes back to the peer review processes that have been imposed by journals on their curation, if you want to put it that way, of the processes. But I think it would be very useful if we actually had some data, as in fact was said earlier by Nicola.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, Michael. My comment was going to be that I don't think there is enough research to understand the differences. I think it's the work around that is growing. So there's a great conference called the Peer Review Congress that happens every 4 years, and there's a lot of research on peer review published through that conference. There's an institute here in the UK called the Research on Research Institute that does some research into peer review, but we definitely need much more to understand, you know, so just take one example. If we move from single anonymized peer review, which is pretty standard across chemistry and many other disciplines, where, you know, the reviewers are anonymous but the authors are not, what happens when we move to double anonymized, where the author name is removed from the manuscript and in theory it's anonymized? Does that actually make a difference? Is it working? And, you know, I don't think we have strong evidence yet, but that is growing, and I think there is definitely a lot of work going on in that area. But I would also say, you know, in terms of thinking about journals imposing a peer review model on our researchers, we certainly at Royal Society of Chemistry, we want to work with the community who publish in our journals on the peer review model that's best for them. And when we've experimented a little bit with double anonymized peer review, we've found that it's actually quite unpopular with a lot of our authors, possibly because it takes a bit of work to try and anonymize a manuscript. And then there's the questions around, you know, can you really anonymize a research article, especially in the era of, as you've mentioned, Michael, preprint servers and so on? Is it actually even possible to anonymize properly a manuscript? But so yeah, my answer is, yeah, we definitely need more, you know, more research, but it's quite difficult to do in a sort of rigorous sort of you know, randomized controlled trial sort of way. Sorry, Michael, you're going to ask something.
Can I ask a question of you, Nicola?
Yep.
It seems to me that a group of publications that might be worth looking at, this is me thinking off my top of my head as we've been talking, is not the set of all publications, because if you've been accepted and published, you're not going to particularly care about how the review is, but it might be interesting to actually look at the set of papers that were rejected and to look at the sort of characteristics of the reviewers that have been in fact round that subset of papers. It might actually give you a clue to, you know, are the majority of the people being rejected from the Global South? Are they sort of women? And I know of your very excellent work you did. So I think that might be actually an interesting thing to have a look at on some group of journals. Definitely,
there's a huge amount that could be done. There's lots of work is I think ongoing. I think Elsevier quite recently released a data set for researchers to use to do this kind of work. So you know, it's definitely on the table. I would just say that there are lots of challenges with that around confounding factors around, you know, the quality of submitted articles and so on. So it's definitely an active area of research, and I definitely would call for more to be done there, but it's certainly not simple.
I'd love to hear also from Hasib and Pradeep about your perspectives of different models. Oh, I don't know, maybe Hasib, I saw your hand up momentarily before Pradeep, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, I was just wondering, since we see so much diversity in the review system, there's so many things, so many options, so many practices. If we do not have enough knowledge how those actually evolve, if we are saying that, I think we do have understanding that certain mechanisms is not working in certain disciplines probably. Otherwise, this is my understanding, we wouldn't have that kind of diversity in peer review system. From now we are talking about triple anonymized peer review system, in fact. So I believe we do have understanding, maybe not research, but I do believe there are some research as well. Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead, Pradeep.
My question is very simple. Why don't we give the authors the choice? Nicola is saying that some authors were not happy. So I say, okay, you choose single blind, double blind, just my opinion on that one. But I have seen that open review has a different outcome. So if you have seen, is this the review comments will be revealed or not revealed, and the reviewer names. Even if you say that reviewer names are revealed, so competing interest thing is actually mostly gone from that side. Okay, and then if you say even the reviewer comments will be revealed or will be open, and then the good thing with that one is diversity, then you cannot comment on that you must get it checked with a native English speaker. You know, those kind of comments and the minor things go away immediately. You know, so sometimes if all three reviewers say the same thing about minor changes of language and composition, you know, I always confuse these two, but language composition and the article structure and the phrasing, and then they write 10 comments on those things, and then it's get rejected. But if it's open review, it will be a diversity will come into play in that one. I say, okay, let me not say these things because this thing may not matter in the science. So open review and choice to the authors. And maybe if reviewer has always has a choice of declining, accepting. If they don't accept double blind or single, they can choose so as well. So they already are choosing, why not authors? Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think that's a really interesting question. You know, certainly I think that, you know, providing modulating transparency. I mean, the question is who gets to choose whether they are revealing their identity or not. Like, should reviewers also get to choose, or do we feel like the benefit is so compelling that reviewers must sign their names and must have the reports public? Well, I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on that, but I think in general, you make a really, really important point about the fact that maybe some transparency can help to bring light and be a disinfectant. Sunlight is a disinfectant, perhaps. I want to, you know, since we're now talking a little bit about interventions, I don't necessarily want to cut short this conversation because it's so important, and we're going to be devoting a lot of time in the later part of the session to this. But I want to talk just, you know, as we're beginning to this conversation about the barriers, I want to ask the question as a couple additional questions. First is, what are the barriers to collecting data from journals? Is this a resourcing question? Is this a question of sort of that there may be objections or sensitivity around revealing data around demographic information? I'm curious, you know, from the panel, like what is blocking us from getting a better quality of evidence base on this? And yeah, certainly I feel I'd be very interested to hear from Nicola, given your expertise in this area, but other panelists too.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes, if we're thinking about collecting demographic data, so diversity data of you know, people publishing in our journals or reviewers, editors, and so on, I think the barriers are really they're not insurmountable, but they are complex. So there's issues around, you know, privacy concerns from our community. You know, do you trust the journal to treat your data in an appropriate way? Authors may be concerned that if they provide their diversity data, that could be used to, you know, to create even more bias in the process, or all sorts of sort of legal barriers in terms of making sure that you're complying with privacy regulation, you know, general data protection regulation in the EU and others, and then just having the right systems and processes in place to actually collect the data at the right point and without it being really complicated for everybody involved, or, you know, having to ask people multiple times to provide their data. So there are yeah, a huge number of complexities, and actually a third one, another one I should have mentioned was around, you know, what data do you actually want to collect, and how do you collect that in an appropriate way? So if we're talking about gender, you know, what's the right way to ask someone about their gender, or race and ethnicity, even more complicated in a global environment where we're, you know, publishers are often, their community of authors and reviewers come from all over the world. So what is an appropriate way that, you know, researchers globally will understand when you ask them to identify their ethnic background, for example? And in some parts of the world, there's huge sensitivity to being asked to identify your race and ethnicity, and in some parts of the world it's just not common at all. So for those of us based in the United Kingdom, the United States, we are, you know, used to being asked to identify our race and ethnicity in other parts of the world that's just not common at all and not well understood. So yeah, it is really a complex area, and so in order to start collecting the data, that does require publishers to invest the time and the resources in doing it right. So we're probably starting to move into solutions a little bit more now, but I've been working on leading an initiative called the Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing, and we've been tackling this issue of data collection and working together across the sort of publishing sector to figure out some of these challenges and how do we actually collect the data, what systems do we use, what questions do we ask. So that, yeah, I don't know if you want me to sort of continue elaborating on that or if we're waiting for the solutions part of the discussion, but yeah, it's definitely an active area of activity for publishers.
Yeah, that's great. I think we should perhaps hold off on this question of data collection for solutions point. But yeah, I'd love to hear if there's any other comments from the panelists about, yeah, the challenges of the data collection. Pradeep.
Very quick. So it's as Nicola said, it's very difficult to actually assign race and ethnicity in several parts of the world. In South Africa, when I came from India, so I never asked this question in India. I like studied and worked in India for like 25 years, and then suddenly land up in South Africa, and it's now the race is Indian. Okay, and now but in some cases, if you go to Elsevier website, they say Asian, and now Asian is now very difficult to now choose other and say Asian Indian. You know, in Asian, this is you will not get a uniform answer in that case, and then the answer if the answers are not same, if there's no uniformity, then it's difficult to collect data when there is no uniformity and there is no concise answer or there is no consistency. So that's my point on that. It's a personal experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on this point about data collection? All right. I think that there's a couple comments from the audience around the issue of what we are asking peer reviewers to do. And I think this is relating to the concept of gatekeeping. It's relating to what people perceptions and the culture around what we think peer review is. But I'd love to talk about this before we move on to the next part of the discussion. So Martin Dominic has asked whether peer reviewers understand what they're being asked to do. And Bronwyn Decker has raised the question of whether we need training in peer review for early career researchers. I would ask whether we need training maybe for all researchers, and if there is a problem with what researchers perceive peer review to be. So I would love to know, you know, are we asking peer reviewers the right thing? What are they? How is the notion of what peer review is transmitted through the culture, and do we need to change that? Oh, yeah, I see Michael first and then Pradeep.
We explored this issue in an occasional paper that I authored on behalf of the ISC publication group. It's up on our website, which talks about research integrity and the role of publishing. And that paper, endorsed by ISC, comes down very squarely on the fact that we need to rebalance the two objectives that peer review appears to have. One, about the methodological soundness of what is actually being proposed, and secondly, a more abstract concept around the innovativeness, the interest, the novelty of what is being proposed. And those two can end up being in conflict. In fact, when the second one gets overweighted, as it occurred in psychology a decade ago, you end up with a major research crisis that psychology went into at the time. So my own view, and it's articulated in this discussion paper for people who are interested, is I believe, and I said it earlier, that first pre-publication review should put a greater emphasis on the methodological part of it, the assurance that the underpinning data is available in a repository, and three, that there is at least a reasonable opportunity for people to replicate their research, someone else to replicate that research. And there have been a number of interesting studies done of the replicability of various papers and preprint servers, and one tends to come down with a rather disheartening view that nobody can actually interpret or repeat the experiments. So I actually think the question that was raised by Dominic is the critical question. And I know that partly journal responses is they want to sell their journal for increasingly interesting, exciting, innovative research. But of course, with the shift to pay for publishing with open access, read and publish, with the emphasis going on publishing. And I think therefore the question of review should come back very much to methodological, and even more importantly, is this work likely to be replicable? And if not, then send it back and let them do some work.
Thank you. And I think Pradeep was possibly next, and then Nicola.
Thank you, Michael and Jessica. So what Martin asked is Martin is also from the GYA. Is one of the former alumni of GYA, and he stole one of the solutions actually. So I had to now maybe I can jump in my solutions into this answer. So I attended and Nicola, please forgive me. So I attended ACS reviewer practice thing, okay, and you can have it's very small, 6 hours or 8 hours journey, and then you can write an exam kind of thing, and they give you a certificate. It's a very nice opportunity to do for ECRs. And then I even heard of pre-review open. I can just name that. It's pre-review open reviewers pilot program. It was, so you have an ECR as an early career research is a mentee, and you have an editor mentor, and then they mentor-mentee relationship, and they teach or they train, but there is no formal training. That's a part of the problem. Okay, so if there is no formal training so we train our researchers. So I have some PhD students. We train them how to write a research paper, but we never train them how to review a research paper. Okay, so journal clubs also, there are some journal clubs but I think they don't review actually. There's already published paper. So it's very interesting. It's a good actually exercise for next week for my students, that they'll give them some papers to review from our own group, but they've anonymized, and they won't know. We have a very big group of 50 people, so they won't know which paper it is from. And then maybe we can try that one. So yeah, formal training is lacking. That's true, and I agree with Martin. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Thanks. Yeah, I just to add to both of those great comments, that yeah, I think there is a role for formal training. I think some of the challenges around that are identifying who's responsible for providing that training. I think there's been a bit of a gap there in taking ownership for that. I think publishers are now starting to fill that gap a bit. And the great example of ACS, who have a really nice reviewer training program, is one of those, and there are many others. So I think, yeah, who it should be responsible for that? Does it sit with publishers? Is there a role, as Pradeep mentioned, for principal investigators to support their students with all of that? And then the second point is, what do we expect of peer reviewers? What do we expect them to be able to do? And I think that's a really, really big and important question, because I find there's an increasing expectation on peer reviewers to be able to detect, any kind of data errors, even, to be able to detect fraudulent papers. And I think some of those expectations are unrealistic, and we need to think about how we can supplement the human element of peer review, and what do we expect the humans involved in the peer review process to do with what was mentioned earlier around this sort of AI or machine aspects of what can be automated through algorithmic checks and so on, and how do we get that balance right to make sure that those two, the sort of human element of peer review and the machine element of peer review, are working together, and we have the appropriate sort of input from both of those, because I think the expectations on peer reviewers to be able to detect every kind of problem with a manuscript in the few hours they spend reviewing it is becoming unrealistic.
I totally agree.
Thank you all. And Hasib.
I would like to take a different view on building the capacity of reviewers. When an author submits his or her paper, we never ask them, have you published before? Do you know how to write? But in case of peer reviewer, we already know that they have done something, they understand, they have published research. So they have interacted with peer reviewer in their own disciplines, if not the particular journal that approached them to become peer reviewer. So I'm just wondering why we are focusing so much on building the capacity of peer reviewers. Is it like that? There are so many journals now. There are so many papers being published online first. That's why we need a bigger pool of peer reviewer. And that's why we are casting our net wider and we are not getting enough qualified one. We don't ask those questions for editors. Do we ask those questions to editors? No, because they know how to edit. So I was just wondering why we are focusing so much on building the capacity of.
Steve, I think I lost your audio for just a moment. I think you may have mentioned why is this focus purely on reviewers? Is that correct? Yes, right. I think that's a very good point. And your question about how we may need to reform the system a bit more broadly, or why we want thinking about this a little bit from a broader perspective is something that I hope we can discuss further in the second half of our conversation today. So let's now move into a discussion about what the solutions are. What actions can we actually take to support greater idea and peer review? So we're going to go into one more poll here using the same Slido code. You can, again, bring up the QR code if your phone allows that. You can go to slido.com and put in 3489304. We are now going to do I believe this one is a free text. So, and it possibly will come out into a word cloud if I'm not mistaken. But I hope that now participants will feel emboldened to maybe suggest some solutions. We've already been talking about them a little bit. Whether, I think maybe there's things that we could do to help support solutions like data collection, changing the culture around publishing, but also what are the more concrete things, new peer review models, training, what are the ideas that you all have that could be used to support changes in publishing? Very interesting. So we're seeing coming up now a lot of different foundational. Whoa! Oh my goodness. Okay. So, well, this is the benefit of the word cloud, that information overload is condensed a little bit by this ranking. So certainly, training is coming up here as a major point. That maybe we need to have a more proactive role about how reviewers are encouraged. I see a lot here of having diversity in academia, diversity on editorial boards, more accountability, calling out bad examples, investments and recognition. So maybe that's something to say that to really recognize how important this is. So let's give this a couple more minutes. I still see some people continuing to type here, but visibility, profiles, I see a lot of these ideas coming up, piloting new ideas, and unconscious bias training. That's another, I think, flavor of training. It's a little bit more specific. So great, a lot of ideas here. Let's give it another 10 seconds in case anyone wants to get any last ideas in here. But I also want to call out that editor training is very popular as an idea too. Great. So, all right. I think that we're having we're reaching the tail end here. I want to hear now from our panelists. How do you react to this word cloud? But also perhaps what do you have in your mind as the most important solutions? So let's go again in the order that we began with. First with Michael, followed by Hasib, Pradeep, and Nicola. So first, over to you, Michael.
Well, I've actually already made my little pitch here, so I'm probably going to save us a little bit of time. I think the biggest change is really a change in the valuing of publication within the science system, namely a shift to the use of what I would call regulated peer preview, a preprint service, which puts the emphasis very much back on the authors, because I don't believe until your paper has passed some of the checks of, not in great detail. And I agree with Nicola that we're asking reviewers to do almost the impossible. But if you are reviewing a paper and you ask yourself the question, could I possibly replicate this experiment? And if the answer is no, I don't really understand what they've done, then to put it bluntly, that paper shouldn't be published. So I think we can shift the perspective of that, and it would have some significant impact on the improvement of people's publications if they did beforehand. And it would cut down what I think is one of the major issues we're facing with this critical question of review capacity, is we're producing more and more papers. And if you actually stop and think that quite a few of them can't be replicated, then there is in fact a significant waste of human talent going on here. So I personally believe that. On a more practical issue, and you picked this up, Jessica, in one of the little things running across, I think we need to recognize that key people in the groups, and I put editorial boards, editors, etc., should undergo some formal cognitive bias training. We did this within the Academy of Science in Australia, which had a rather appalling record of gender diversity a few years ago. And under the then council and the president, we worked particularly hard on our core sectional committees, which screen applicants, and made several quite important changes. One, we recognized DORA, so volume went out the window. But secondly, the cognitive bias was really interesting. And you found very, very senior people saying, oh, I didn't understand that. I didn't understand that. And the result was that last year, we've shifted our gender statistics quite spectacularly over 3 or 4 years. So I actually think that journals ought to run that sort of trial through their editorial boards to just become aware of the issues in a broader perspective.
Thanks, Michael. Really interesting to hear about that success with the bias training. Certainly something that I think it is a really important approach for many people, regardless of just editors. So next, let's go to Hasib.
Thank you. I would like to make a couple of points in terms of solution. I think we have to think of shared responsibility, because if we are thinking of peer review is helping us to ensure research integrity, we can't give the whole responsibility to peer reviewers or the peer review system. As Michael rightly mentioned, that the responsibility should go to authors if we're thinking of a preprint system. What about their supervisor or the funders or editors, and of course the host institutions? So my first point is we need to invest more in building capacity of all the elements, all the actors in terms of research ethics, as Michael has mentioned, that the cognitive understanding. So how they are conducting the research, how they are writing it, and how they are using it. So the whole spectrum. And my second point is related to that as well, where at the beginning, in his opening remark, Michael also mentioned about system change, isn't it? So I just want to reiterate that when we are talking about idea in peer review, it is just a part, isn't it? We have to think of idea in the whole scholarly publishing system and the research ecosystem. Otherwise, without improving the larger system, it is really difficult to effectively make idea work in peer review. Otherwise, we will be just expanding the pool of peer reviewer, as I mentioned in my last comment, in the name of idea, but we might be actually simply exploiting the free level of early career researchers. Thank you.
Fantastic point, Steve, and I think really also relating to this issue of recognition and valuing of peer reviewing, which I think we'll also talk about later in the session too. So I think now let's go to Pradeep.
Thank you, Jessica. So, you know, when I saw this call the first time, then I don't really I agree with idea, but I think there's a letter missing from idea. It should be actually ideas. Okay, there must be an S at the end of idea, and then that's then I wrote in my case, I will just say that additional letter S is standing for various aspects: self-care, support, space, and even global south. Okay, so training aspects become the support part of it. Okay, so ideas in peer review, rather than idea in peer review, will include a support part of it. So it could be support to those who are including to reach the experience, sustain the supply of services. Again, SSS, you sustain the number of reviewers, you sustain the services, as well as the space. You need to give the new reviewers or the diverse reviewers that you're bringing in their own space. Okay, so you, rather than now, okay, you can train them, you can mentor them, but give them their space, give them their pace as well, you know, at what pace they want to do the research. So if they're not experienced, they may take more than 2 weeks to review a paper. Okay, they might want to read more. So if you want to say this review is due in 2 weeks for everyone, is difficult. Okay, so give them their own space as well as, so and also want to say that one more thing is that everyone has a time limit. For example, in thesis examinations, so you cannot use an examiner for more than 3 times or 5 times. Okay, so administrators have, head of the department, schools, they always have a time limit, like 5 years of, or again maybe another 5 years. Why not editors? Okay, so why not we rolling out editors, or you know, that so the new people or diversity will come from that side. New ideas can come, new challenges can come, new perspectives can come into the editorial board of a journal. Okay, I don't know how frequently but the ones that I publish in, I have seen those editors for maybe 20 years. Okay, so maybe even more. So it's that's my 2 points. So idea to ideas, and then there must be a time limit, or there must be a continuous rollover between the people running the business. Thank you.
Thanks, Pradeep. And finally, Nicola.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think when I'm talking about the sort of what actions we're going to take, I'm going to go back to my opening statement where I spoke about the challenge of diversity data. And I think one thing, a really fundamental thing that journals and publishers can start to do is to start collecting diversity data. So I've been leading on an initiative called the Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing that I mentioned a moment ago. I'm just going to share the link in the chat in a moment. And that's a cross-publisher initiative. And as a group, we've been working on this question of how do we go about collecting data and all of those complexities that I spoke about before. And we have come up with some recommended questions for the collection of gender identity and race and ethnicity data. The race and ethnicity question in particular has had, you know, a huge amount of input from different publishers, but also from a subject matter expert who was an expert in racial categorization. And we've tried to put forward a way that we can collect this data in the global context in a way that's relevant for researchers around the globe, because as was mentioned earlier, if we don't have comparable data sets, you know, between journals, between publishers, then you know, the data is less useful. So I'd encourage any publishers or journal editors on the call, you know, really take a look at that and consider starting to collect diversity data if you're not doing that already. And as a group, that initiative, again, as a group of publishers, we also worked with some of the major peer review system providers, and so they are now delivering the functionality for journals to actually enable journals to collect diversity data during that submission and peer review process. So again, it's over to the publishers and journals to start making use of that functionality, and really, you know, carrying out that data collection in ideally in a sort of consistent, standardized way will really enable us to understand that diversity baseline of our communities and start to identify the right actions to really improve representation and inclusion of underrepresented groups. And also importantly, actually measure whether, you know, the interventions and the actions that we're taking are working. And just lastly, in agreement with Michael, I think, training for editors and reviewers has a really important role to play, making sure that editors and reviewers understand implicit bias and how it can influence their decisions and their recommendations, and really giving them the tools to work towards eliminating biases in decision making. And related to that as well, making sure that publishers and journals, well, I think publishers and journals really do need to take a look at our sort of traditional peer review models, as we spoke about earlier, and start to think about embracing some of those alternatives, whether that's double anonymized or more transparent options. I think we need to start, investing in understanding those different models and embracing them where they can make a difference.
Thanks, Nicola, and all panelists for your really interesting remarks here. I think we've raised so many valuable points about what can be done. I think just riffing off a little bit of Nicola's last point here, that double anonymized review is one potential solution. I want to tie this to the conversation we were having earlier about the patent application system, or preprints, or post-publication review, where there is a version of the manuscript or the scholarship that's put online openly ahead of formal publication, or ahead of this peer review process, if you will. So I think that there's a challenge here in that by being open and by telling other people about the work that you're doing, you are basically reducing the pool of potential reviewers who don't know that you did this. And I think preprints or this post-publication model are maybe a very clear instance of this. But I really think it extends to openness in different aspects. It may be, if we have a double anonymized system and people want to preserve that, will they be disincentivized from talking to others about their work? What effect could that have on science? I would love to hear from the panel about the trade-off and the tension, and if there's any way around, can we have our cake and eat it too with this system, or what is a better model to move forward? Michael.
I need to unmute myself. I guess I'm puzzling a little bit at the notion of a trade-off here. Because I think, well, I guess what I'm struggling with, it still seems to hang on the fact that, as Nicola said in the beginning, part of the currency of academia, the currency of scientists, is a publication record. And by inference, it's a publication record which is better if it is bigger and longer, and if it is one that I can point to having published a paper in some high impact journal, even if my own paper has never ever been cited, I get credit for it. So I actually think that if we in the research community, when we do our own evaluations, whether that's for a grant, and I think the funding agencies are now beginning to move to crack down on long publication records. The National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia is moving in that direction. And many academies I know are now saying, we want to know your top 10, 20, I'd prefer to say your top 5 publications and be done with it. So I think we need to shift that ground, because then it becomes much more likely that your most significant 5 publications or 10 publications are going to be assessed over some period of time. And if you are publishing papers which have poor methodology in them, and I don't mean fraud, etc., I just mean, sloppy procedures around your statistics, etc., then I think putting them up on a peer review and post-peer review, pointing out that, yes, your data set you use to give you a 5.1% significance really isn't a well-balanced data set. I think that shames it, but in the end it comes back to the fact if you did a bit of better research. So I don't think we should flourish too much on that. We should just take a view that we should be decreasing the incentives to publish lots of stuff which isn't in fact produced as well as you could probably produce it if you published a lot like it. I remember one of my PhD students complained because I insisted we publish one paper instead of 3. And I told him that would be a much better paper, and it was. But, you know, I'm old-fashioned.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. I think in the life sciences, where my background is, I think we have almost the opposite problem, where students are spending 5-6 years to come out with a single paper. And I think there's a lot of knowledge sharing that is slowed down by this practice of building this huge story. But I definitely take your point. The quality is not something that is always emphasized. Pradeep.
Yeah, thank you. So Jessica, because you said life sciences, so I said, let me jump in. So I really like the idea of preprint in one very peculiar aspect, is that to publish something, you need 10 types of data. Let's say you're making some delivery system or a biomaterial or tissue engineering system, and then you need to now have 10 types of studies done to prove it, or for publication, not to prove the aspect. You can prove the aspect in 2 aspects. You can do 2 studies, and you can you know this thing works or it doesn't work. So you have the crux of the data in 2 studies, but you still need to go to do the other 8 to meet the publication guidelines. For example, if you're working with a biomacromolecule, then you need to tell the molecular weight of it. Okay, sometimes you don't have the capacity or the instrument, or it's not working. It's a very expensive study to do, but it's a regulatory requirement by the journal. Then rather go to preprint and do it. Okay, and publish the data that is most essential and least, but it will never pass through peer review, because as soon as it goes, it say, okay, it's a nano system, I need to see the nano size, although you already have some data proving that. So yeah, that's but it's not a peer review. I think I'm talking as an author, because you raised the life sciences issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Pradeep. Nicola.
Yeah, just to come back to this issue about that, I think you're right, Jessica, to raise this tension between open science and something like double anonymized peer review. And I think it's really interesting to raise that issue that actually, if we start pushing towards more double anonymized peer reviewed, are we actually disincentivizing open science practices? And that is a real tension. As Royal Society of Chemistry, we're committed to open science. We want to encourage all of the good principles of open science. And so what I would sort of propose is, certainly in the longer term, I think the solution may be to just move towards more transparency in our peer review. And we've been experimenting with transparent peer review on some of our journals, where we publish the reviewer comments, the author's the author's response to the reviewers, and the editor's decision letter alongside the manuscript. Our reviewers remain anonymous, so they are anonymous reviewer reports that we publish, but I think that's a step in the right direction to put all of this assessment and all of the work that goes into evaluating a manuscript prior to publication, put that out there, out in the open for everyone to see, and hopefully that has that benefit of encouraging more constructive reviewer comments, focusing on the right aspects of the manuscript and not things like the author's identity. So I wonder if that's actually the direction of travel. I think or should be the direction of travel. I think in terms of open peer review where reviewers are named, I think perhaps longer term that's the route we take. I think in the current science culture that has problems for for example, for early career researchers who are asked to put their name to review of a more senior colleague in the community, and may be worried about implications of putting critical comments, things like that. So I think in the current science culture, named reviewer reports potentially still present some challenges, but I think as we move towards this more open science, I think probably that the peer review needs to move towards more openness as well.
Thanks, Nicola. And Hasib, I'm curious if you have anything to add to this. Yeah.
Just listening to you all, I was just thinking, we are saying that peer review is happening before the publication, or in some instances after the publication. There are 2 models. But if we think in a much broader way, in the lifetime of a particular paper, even after it is published, after passing through peer review process, if people are not appreciating it, isn't it like that peer review is a kind of a never-ending process? because we are not appreciating that research, because it is not adding any value, despite the fact it has passed through peer review, but it is not being cited. So I was just thinking, we are seeing it that it is a kind of a one-shot thing, that peer review will be happening before it is being published. I think it's a lifetime thing as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hasib. I think that's a really fascinating point. And I would ask, is our current model of relying on citations for this really fit to purpose, given that a citation can mean so many different things? It can mean a reputation, it can mean an endorsement. But definitely, as we've discussed, some of the ideas that we've been talking about, reproducibility, we won't know. A traditional peer review process really cannot fully reproduce a paper. So I think that's a really fantastic point. So I noticed that there's some questions, some points from the audience, namely one raised by Tracy Elliott, which gets back to our conversation about, are we asking, I think Hasib made this point, are we asking early career researchers or more people to just participate in unpaid labor that is effectively underappreciated? So how do we create professional recognition of this role? There's a lack of incentives for peer reviewers, and how do we, what should that be? What should that recognition be? Yeah, Hasib, please go ahead.
I was just wondering, recognition by whom? I mean, who is the authority to recognize? Why I am trying to become recognized? Is it a part of my career? Then obviously, who is going to judge whether my contribution as a peer reviewer is adding value? So I think we need to ask those questions, that when we say, because we know that when you publish a paper, you know that whether the impact factor, whether it is indexed or not, who is going to recognize it. We know those entities. As Michael rightly mentioned, that it is the currency, isn't it? But working behind, yes, Pablon, I have got my account. When I peer review something, it is always get connected to, it build up my profile. But I think we need to understand that whether peer review or voluntary contribution of this kind is recognized by the people which actually have a say as my career progresses. So I think we have to identify them. Obviously, the committees which actually recruit and promote and offer scholarship, whether they are ready to appreciate peer review as a contribution. I don't know, but we need to target them, who to recognize. Thank you.
So I think, Jessica and Tracy asked the question. Yes, so I will say, so it's as my mentor always used to say that, it's a academic citizenship that you have to do. So for every paper you publish, you do 3 peer reviews, because 3 reviewers reviewed your paper, you review 3 papers. And it's giving back to the publication system. It's like, it's voluntary work kind of. I have seen Pablons is giving, it's not at least collating data. Pablons, Web of Science now, it's not Pablons anymore. So yeah, Pablons is giving some recognition in terms of collecting data. Some reviewers can give you excellent reviewer points. Elsevier, I think, suppose used to have excellent reviewer or recognized reviewer, something like that, some certification. So there are some recognitions still already there. There are some journals who give some vouchers to pay their open access fees, so that can be also be looked at. So there are few of them. I have come across 5 or 6 recognitions that you can really and top 5, top 20 reviewers in the field, maybe, so that's some recognition you can count on, but not money. I don't think there is monetary for the time at the time being, for sure. Thank you.
Nicola.
Yeah, no, that's great. It was just really great to hear from Hasib and Pradeep, as you know, active researchers about the kind of recognition and what it means to them. So as you know, someone coming from the journal publisher side of things, you know, we're really interested in how we can better recognize and reward our reviewers. But and you know, so we have we work with what was Publons, now the Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Platform. So we link that up to our peer review system. We, you know, recognize our outstanding reviewers once a year. We give discounts on our books program, that kind of thing. So we're sort of trying to think about, you know, little ways that we can give back and say thank you to our reviewers. But I think Hasib probably really nailed it there when it's who do researchers want recognition from? It's all very well having a certificate from a publisher saying, oh, you're a great reviewer, but if you're you know, the person deciding on your promotion doesn't care whether or not you've reviewed, that doesn't matter. So for me, I think it's understanding this idea of peer review as part of scholarship and it being recognized as such, and therefore recognized by institutions, funders, and so on as, you know, an activity worthy of sort of merit and being taken into account in terms of someone's overall contribution to scholarship, more than just looking at their publications, and not just publications and reviews. You know, it obviously goes beyond that into other activities that academic researchers get involved with. But for me, I think it's that question of how do we support researchers to better understand, researchers, employers to better understand the value of peer review as part of scholarship.
Thank you all. Absolutely. I mean, I think that making the data available is one question, but that how do you get people to actually really internalize that and care is another fantastic point. I want to, so we have about 15 minutes left in our time together. I want to make sure that we can address a couple of other questions that have been posed by the audience. So Rula Inglesi-Lotz has asked, if a peer is someone from the same field, how do we deal with multidisciplinary research? So, you know, as research is becoming more multidisciplinary, how do we do this? And, you know, what do we do with this perhaps overlapping expertise? How do we address this?
Yeah, I could just make a quick point from the sort of journal perspective. It's definitely, you know, a challenge, and it comes down to having enough reviewers on the manuscript to cover the different aspects of the manuscript. So if it's a very, you know, focused on one piece of research, you might only need, you know, 2 reviewers. But if it's a very multidisciplinary paper, you know, we'll need to bring in more experts. And I would encourage anyone serving as a reviewer of a multidisciplinary paper to be very clear to the editor about which aspects of the manuscripts they have and have not reviewed, you know, which aspects their expertise actually covers, because that will, you know, help the editor understand, okay, you know, the 2 reviewers I've got so far have actually only looked at one aspect of the work, and therefore I'm going to have to seek further input.
Any other comments, Pradeep?
Keywords, that's my answer to that. So if when you submit paper and I work in multidisciplinary as well, a lot of pharmaceuticals and biomaterials, and if the keywords of the article, as well as when you submit if you choose the right fields, actually it goes really well with the I think most of the journals do provide a nice list these days. You can have several subsections to go into actually and choose those ones. So I follow that one. That's my personal perspective. Thank you.
Any other comments, Steve? Yes.
I think, yes, initially, definitely it is a kind of struggle for the editors as well. I think there are journals which are multidisciplinary, and there are teams which obviously bring together different researchers to tackle different aspects of a particular research. But sometimes I have seen that there are research institutions and organizations which are very much into, I mean, is it kind of a transdisciplinary approach they take? So I think we also not only focus on a particular expert focusing on a particular aspect or section of or direction of a particular manuscript, we also need to open up to embrace or invite those scholars, those researchers who actually have that kind of broader knowledge as well. Because otherwise, if different person is looking into different piece, so we are actually, what's the meaning of having a particular manuscript, one research, isn't it? So yes, multiple experts reviewing a particular paper, but also one expert who has got some broader idea, they should be invited as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another question here. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental issue for science because the most exciting science is occurring where disciplines collide or where disciplines come together. And I think, again, there's no simple answers, but I think the principles we tried to argue on the ISC paper, that the key things we need to worry about, I'm just going to repeat myself, the key things we need to worry about at the initial review are questions of availability of data and reproducibility. Let me take one simple example. There's some very interesting science coming out. In fact, a new emerging science between using machine learning and image processing in biology to actually develop new ways of integrating biological data. Phenomenal opportunities. Very difficult to assess, but not impossible to bring together the core elements of what researchers should tell other researchers about. On the ML side, what's your training set? What does it look like? What characterizations have got it? And for reviewers, my own personal view is you do not need to know an expert to answer those questions. In fact, Nicola probably knows of this, but a couple of journals I know have gone to pre-author checklists where you actually have to fill out a set of questions yourself as an author. Have you got an ethics clearance? Have you registered your trial if you do it, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you put the onus back on the authors of the paper. And I think sometimes we forget that the authors collectively ought to be responsible for the paper. And so there's a tendency to sort of say, I know this little bit, this person did that. And I think we need to remind our academic colleagues that when you put your name on a paper, you're putting your name on the whole of the paper. And therefore, it's up to you to test some of those things. So I think, again, coming back to what we asked the initial reviewers to look for in a signature, not of a brilliant paper, but necessarily of a paper that might engineer some subsequent discussion, I think would help this question of multidisciplinarity very much. Because I certainly think it has to be embraced because that's the way science is going.
Thank you so much. So let me ask one final question before we move into the kind of poll at the end of our session. Vicki Gardner has raised the question of accessibility. How do we foster inclusion of neurodivergent participants, people who are visually impaired? Is this primarily about technology, culture change, training, all of the above? Yeah, Nicola, please go ahead.
I'll go first on this one and be very honest to say that I think we're certainly speaking from the journals and publishers perspective, I think we're at very early stages of understanding that well. I think we probably so far are focusing on our technology systems. So in making sure that our content delivery, so our platforms where we publish our content, making sure that that's accessible and, you know, thinking about screen readers and those sorts of things. But I think to some of those broader points around neurodivergence and so on, I think it probably is a mixture of all those different things that Vicky's mentioned, you know, technology, culture change, training. But I would probably be very honest to say that from my perspective, I think we're still very early on in thinking about that. But it is very much rising up in terms of a conversation and a topic for publishers to address. But very interested to hear any of the other panelists' thoughts on that.
Pradeep.
Yes, so we do have an example in our school where we have a professor who is visually impaired, and so he uses a lot of things actually to do examination of thesis. Actually, he always accesses the online version, and then he uses the audio tool on his system. So he has several tools, and then and the school even arranged for an assistant when requested, like an hourly basis. So, but this must come from but for reviewer, I'm not sure how it works, but for examiners, so there are some tools already available which can be used to access the content. Yeah, I have an experience. That's why I just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other comments on this issue? Certainly, I think that basic things like providing alt text for images and making sure that content is machine readable would help support many of the technologies Pradeep has just mentioned. Any other final comments on this point? All right, I think that given that we have just about 7 minutes left, I would love to move us now into the last question, which I think we can put to everyone in this session. We would like to ask you to now, instead of doing a word cloud, we're going to have a single answers. What is your key takeaway from today's discussion? So please just put in a single phrase, a single sentence that relates to us, what you take away from this conversation. So again, you can use the same Slido link, and we'll see the answers pop up. So I think we've certainly talked about open review, post-publication review, transparency, and I know that there's questions in the chat which we did not have time to address about how competing interests, is transparency sufficient to address all these competing interests? There are no easy answers. Yes, absolutely. I think that it's very tempting to want to solve this problem, but it's really something very pervasive. Thinking about the ways in which reviews are done, as much as who is doing them, I think both of those are really important questions. So let's leave this up for just a few more minutes and see if there's any other takeaways. But more structured training. I really think that that's a very good idea too. Implicit bias training, and certainly something that I think it can be combined with other interventions. Multilingual support. And cooperation and centralization also. So I see one more person typing. Let's give this just another 5 to 10 seconds because I want to ensure we have enough time for the panelists to wrap up as well. So if you have any last ideas, let's get them in just a moment. Yeah, and I think also this idea of how do you help people who identify biases? Whose job is it to identify biases? How do we support people who want to fight against them? All right, thank you so much for your input today. I want to now return to the panelists and just ask them in the last couple minutes, I would love to go around, just do a quick round. What is for you the most important takeaway from this conversation? Let's first go in the order that we've been practicing. So Michael, what do you take away from this conversation?
One of the sentences that flowed across the screen a few minutes ago was lots of questions to discuss with colleagues. I really think that this is the important part of the exercise. Coming out of the ISC publication work, I've been talking to my colleagues, and it amazes me that very few of them know what is actually happening. And so I think that the question is, for those people around the audience today, go talk to 5 people next time you have a cup of coffee in your staff room. Talk to people about these issues, because I just do not think most of the scientists in the world today know of these particular issues. So I think that's where I'd take it away today. Optimism, because I think they're being discussed by important groups, but the important groups are probably not the people who need to think about these issues any longer.
Thank you, Michael. And I think certainly discussions are very important, as I've taken away from today as well. So Hasib, over to you.
When we are talking about diversity, inclusion, equity, definitely the publishing industry is led by the global north, no doubt about it. And the journals, the good journals, if I use the word reputed, prestigious journals, impact factor journals. And they are essentially, obviously, international. They have to be. That's why when you are publishing international research, definitely the understanding of diversity, you understand who to include and how to include in editorial board, on the editorial board, or the reviewer, or the author, or the research arena. But we shouldn't forget about the journals which are national, regional as well. There are thousands of journals. We may question the way they are run, and the quality of peer review, but we can't just just exclude them from the discussion. And in those societies, they are sometimes they become a kind of a silo because the editors, the authors, the publishers, the reviewers, all are from the same group. Can we say that they are not diverse? That's why they are not productive. They are not doing good thing in their own way. They are doing fantastic. Probably the purpose is being served. It is contributing to national development. So my point is, yes, global north is leading. We understand, but we shouldn't say that. Well, since we understand, hey, global south, come to us. I think we need to collaborate. We need to meet in the middle. We need to create connection between the societies, between the publishers, between the disciplines. So that is quite important. Otherwise, the discussion on idea might not be complete. That's my take on message. Or that's the last word I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasib. A very important point. Yeah, are we always inviting people to join into a system that's created by the North, or are we actually creating and recreating a system that's more inclusive? Let's go to Pradeep now.
Thank you, Jessica, and I agree with Hasib 100%. And I think Martin wrote somewhere, either in the chat or in the Q&A, that why not we move into a global community from a global south, global north perspective, I suppose. There was, I read the comment somewhere a while ago, but my three takeaway messages will be said. So we saw in the poll number 2 was training and support coming out at the top number. Okay, so the support is required. Okay, and it's at all levels, not only ECRs and editors and reviewers. Actually, at all levels, the support is required. Training is required. Maybe changes in the perspective is required. Then the perspective comes to action. Then Michael's thought of changing the system. And if you see the comments again, I was reading. So gender and geography favors the same gender and geography. Okay, and how do we find the balance? Okay, if we change from global south to global north, what is the guarantee that global north, the south is not favoring global south again? So where is the balance, and how do we make sure that this is maintained in a most what you say practical way? And the last one, the last comment from my side is the last comment that I had in the first round is, please everyone around the panel and as well as the audience, value the review provided. If someone is providing a review, they're investing their time, trust and value that their input and respect the maybe if there are maybe someone provides only 2 comments on very niche aspects, but if it is multidisciplinarity, not everyone knows everything. Okay, so if they're providing 2 comments on 2 very niche aspects, very special aspects, so value the comment and trust the reviewers. Thank you. That's my closing remarks, and it was a nice opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Over to you, Nicola.
Thanks so much. I think probably my key sort of message is one of the need for collaboration. We spoke a lot at the beginning, especially about the need for change across the sort of scholarly ecosystem, not just peer review. And so in order to affect that change, we need, publishers working together and collaborating on peer review and publishing processes, but also working beyond that with, collaborating with researchers, collaborating across the global north, global south. So for me, collaboration is key. And I'm going to stop there because I know we're running out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicola. Yes, I feel like we could continue having this conversation for another 8 hours, but I think that's not practical for everyone. I want to say a really heartfelt thank you to all of you panelists, the audience for these fantastic points, and the organizers for putting together this really important conversation. Have a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And I hope we can take what we've learned here on to conversations with our other colleagues.